Thank you. In fact, that was the very question I got when I shared with a bunch of friends that I was going to present at Women in Tech. They were like, women in tech? And I said, well, I'm a woman, why not? They said, yeah, but in tech, we thought you were that polyglot person, right? You do languages, you don't do tech. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I'm that polyglot person who does languages, but in fact, I'd like to think that I do tech. In fact, I live with the idea that I do big data. And today I want to talk to you about big data and what I do with it and how we can take intelligent decisions from big data. But before that, I know I owe you the polyglot story, and I have to answer the question, how does one become a polyglot, and how I became one. So, I wanted to tell you the polyglot story, and here it goes. I was very lucky to be growing up in a multilingual environment, first of all. So already at the age of 6, that's me, I spoke Russian and Bulgarian and Persian. And then something happened. I decided I had to learn Dutch. In fact, I was firmly determined to learn Dutch no matter what. There was one problem, though. In the country I lived in, there was no way to learn Dutch. There were no Dutch books, there were hardly any Dutch people, there were no Dutch courses, let alone for children. There was just no way to learn Dutch. I even got to discuss the matter with the Dutch ambassador. I was probably the youngest person he's ever talked to about work, but there was no way to learn Dutch. But that was so important for me that I thought I need to find a workaround. And the workaround I found was that if I couldn't learn Dutch directly, I was going to derive it. I was going to learn all the languages surrounding the area of the Netherlands and Belgium. And then I was going to linguistically compute how they could have influenced the language in the middle and construct it myself. So that was my decision, and I set out to achieve my goal. One by one, I failed them all. First German, and then English, and then Swedish, and then Norwegian. What happened here? And the Swedish, Danish I forgot, Norwegian, and then French. And I have to be honest, I did not construct Dutch myself. But as history went, you know, the Cold War finished, the Iron Curtain fell, so Dutch courses appeared, and at the age of 21, I finally learned Dutch. And the day when I held my Dutch certificate from the Dutch Language Union, highest level possible, I thought, now what? Because, you know, when you're 21 and you achieve your childhood dream, that's a bad idea. I don't recommend it. Somehow it deprives your life of purpose. So there I was, you know, with a couple of languages in my pocket, having achieved my childhood dream, and I thought, what shall I do next? Shall I go and find something harder? What about, you know, learning Zulu? There are absolutely no Zulu books around, you know, no Zulu speakers. So that's going to be a good challenge. But then I thought, that's getting kind of repetitive, right? I've been there, done that, cracked that. I have to find out something else. Luckily, I had another passion. And that other passion appeared at about the same time when I decided to learn Dutch. So when I was the same age, I started tracking the time when the street lamp in front of my window lights up in the evening. So every evening I would be there waiting for it to get lit up, write it down in a notebook, and then proceed to my business. And gradually I collected a lot of data. And then I plotted that data, and voila, I could see it for myself. It was true that in the winter, the nights were longer than in the summer because the graph went up and down, up and down. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I can verify what people tell me by measurements and data. So let's try something else then. Is it actually true that it rains more in the fall than it rains in the summer? So then in the mornings, I started tracking meteorological data because my evenings were busy with the lamp, you know. I was doing that only in the mornings. So I was measuring humidity, temperature, all kind of stuff, plotting it on a chart. And then as I was growing up, I started tracking other things. I started tracking the books I read, measure them, the size, the number of pages. I was plotting that on a chart. I could see the trend. I have to admit, I still do that. I have that very same database, and the trend, unfortunately, is getting negative, but still. And then, I kept growing up. I became a young adult. I loved tracking all that data, and I knew all those languages, so it was only natural for me to go into linguistic science, where when I started my PhD and started collecting so much data from so many languages, and surprisingly, one of that was Zulu. Because I ended up working on a Bantu project for African languages during my postdoc. So I don't speak Zulu. I want to be clear about that, but I know how it works. Okay. And then I was already living on my own, and I was paying my own bills. So then I was tracking, because I had to track something, right? Electricity consumption. And I was tracking my bills and how much I use every day. And I was correlating that with the wind speed outside, because I was living on a truly windy island. And I had this feeling that the wind just blows away all the heat from my home, so I wanted to measure that. And then I had my babies, 1, 2, 3. I was measuring everything connected to babies, when they sleep, when we go for a stroll, and some bodily functions, right? I don't recommend that very much unless you are okay finding out that your baby is a complete outlier, 3 standard deviations away from the median, but, that's fine. And so it went until I found myself moving to the Czech Republic and picking up a job at a company called RWS Moravia, which offers localizations to many big clients all over the world. And I'm pretty sure that I got that job because at the interview, I said all the languages that I spoke, including Zulu. And all of them turned out to be very useful in my daily work, right? Especially Dutch, and I have to say I did solve a couple of terminological issues with Zulu as well. It helped, even though I don't speak it, but the skill I really use, and that really helped me progress in my work, it's the data tracking. So now enough about who I am. Let me talk a little bit about what I do. What I do is truly fascinating because I'm right now in charge of a marvelous team driving an innovative project which offers localization to IT giants through a community model. And to understand that, I first need to explain you what the classic standard model of localization looked like before. So under the standard model, we have a big company like RWS Moravia, which offers translations, localization. And for that, we have translation companies in every country who we call vendors. And with them, we have contracts, and we say, you're going to receive approximately that many words, and you have to translate them, and you have to return them to us within 2 days, 1 day, and so on. And the vendor has to do that. And that is good because we have the safety of knowing that we are going to get back the translations because the vendor is contractually obliged to send them. But the bad thing is that we actually don't know who really the translators are because those companies, they are between the localization company RWS Moravia and the actual human translators, and we don't see through them. With the community model, it's the exact opposite. We know the individual translators in our community by name, or at least by the name they give us. We have full visibility into who they are, what they do, how much they do, and so on. But there is no obligation that they would be returning to us all the translations within a certain time. In fact, they are not even obliged to translate. They are freelancers. If they want to work, they work. If they don't want to work, they don't want to work. And that brings its own challenges, which my team and I are trying to solve. And to show you how we are solving that, we've prepared a small video which is showing you kind of the skeleton of the model in a simplified form. So here we have our translators for language circle, language square, and language triangle. And then we have the client. And the client sends us files. Those files go, of course, to the cloud, like it's full automation. And the moment the files for translation ends up in the cloud, 2 clocks start ticking. The first clock measures 8 hours, and that is the time within which we want the translators to pick up the file, we call that claiming, and start working on it. The second file measures 24 hours. This is the time period within which we want translators to translate it and give it back to us. That is basically the deadline. So those clocks tick, they measure the time, and the translators claim the work, right? They take it from the cloud, they start working, we have translator circle, translate it into the circle language, delivers back within 24 hours, good job, deadline met. And the files keep coming. And now the question is, what happens if the 8-hour clock strikes 8 and no one has picked up that file? What do we do? Well, we have a mechanism through which we can directly push the files to translators, send a notification, nudge them, urge them, ping them, and say, hey, here is a file, you didn't claim it, but don't you want to translate it? So we use that mechanism when the 8 hours elapse, and we push the files to the translators. Here we wake up translator for language square, translator wakes up, translates, delivers the file within 24 hours. Good job, deadline met. And then the files, they keep coming. It's automation, it's a continuous flow. And sometimes strange things happen. For example, here we have translator for language triangle, picks up the file, but instead of starting to translate, she goes to bed. And then the clock keeps ticking and ticking and ticking, but she's still asleep. Now she wakes up after 24 hours, starts translating, sends the file back, that is, uploads it to the cloud, but that's too late. That's not good. That is a scenario we want to avoid. And there are other types of risky behavior. For example, as I show here, we have people who claim the file, right? And you see here, translator square, takes the job, translates, sends the file to client very well. But translator circle, for some reason, sends the file back. This is what we call reject. And that's a very interesting behavior, because we want to know why that file gets rejected. Is it that translator circle simply got a phone call, a very urgent thing happened, and she had to rush outside of her house and drop everything else? Or is it that she simply didn't like the file and decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm sending it back. And I'm going to show you in just a few minutes how big data helps us answer that very question. For now, we are fine, because translator circle sent back the file early enough for another translator of language circle to pick it up, translate it, and deliver within the allocated deadline. Okay, that's how the community basically works in a simplified form. And I am sure that just after this short video, you can imagine how much data we get from this. We measure all sorts of things. We can track where translators are located, in which time zone they are located, on which days of the week they work, how fast it takes them to translate a file, how many files they translate per day or per week or per month, what the quality of the translation is. We have all that data and much more, and then we can correlate it with another type of data. We can make correlation with how much a translator rejects files and how many, or how much time it takes a translator to claim file on average, for example, and what is the quality trend, and how much of the total volume of words to be translated for that one language is processed by that one particular translator, and how does it correlate to the overall size of the community. So that and many other hundreds of thousands of data points stream into our data warehouse on a daily basis and get collected there. And this is when the real fun begins. And I must tell you, it's amazing fun. And to show you how interesting, exciting, and informative it is, I'm going to walk you through just 3 case studies. Take them as user stories. And show you how big data and the way we treat it, analyze it, and work with it helps us answer some interesting questions and solve mysteries. And the first mystery is the mystery of the weekend drops. Ladies and gentlemen, the mystery of the weekend drops. We plotted data from our classic vendors. Remember the translation companies. How many words a day they send us back translated? We plotted it on a timeline, and that's what it looked like. This is per day. And then we said, okay, let's look at how our translator community made out of freelancer works. And that's their data. And here you can see it. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down with a very mysterious regularity. The dips follow certain, intervals. So what are those dips? And why do they appear on both lines? Well, when we looked closer, we saw that those dips, and you almost don't see it here because of the colors, but those dips are Saturday and Sunday. So that's when the lines go down. Okay, we said, we can explain that away for the vendors, because vendors, these are companies, these are businesses, and we know businesses are closed on a Saturday and Sunday, so they don't work and they don't deliver translations, fine. But that's very weird with the community, because these are freelancers, and freelancers typically are not full-time employed translators. They translate when they are free. And people are most free to translate over the weekends because that's when they have free time. So we would actually expect peaks in the weekend from a freelancer community. So what is the mystery here? Hypothesis one was that the vendor companies actually use those very same freelancers that we, through the community, have direct access to. So these are the same people in the end, and they will have the same behavior. That's why the two lines pattern the same way. This wasn't a very popular hypothesis, so we had hypothesis number 2, and that was that maybe there's nothing to translate over weekends, right? Easy to check, more data, and these are the volumes that come from the client to be translated, those files that flow into the cloud. As you can see, they follow the same pattern. So the answer is there's nothing to translate over weekends. That's why we get the mystery of the weekend drops, which is not a mystery anymore. But this actually tells us much more than that. Look carefully and see that the blue line touches the 0 every weekend. So we don't get anything during weekends. Basically, translators don't get anything to work on during weekends. However, the red line does not touch the 0. So even though nothing comes to be translated during a weekend, the translators in the community send back translated files. Why? Well, they stock up on Friday. They pick up the work on Friday, and they do it over the weekend. That's when they send it to us. So, why is that important? Because this tells us that actually community does work during the weekends. And if we have a client who will want to have a continuous coverage of the whole week and send files over weekend and have them translated over weekend, the community can absorb that. Here, the drop is basically artificially caused by the lack of content, but they do work over the weekend. So we just learned so much looking at 3 simple lines. Other things that we can learn. I already teased you and I told you that I'm going to tell you why people reject. And now I'm going to tell you. In order to understand why people reject files, we plotted data of when they reject files compared to when they claim the files. So here we have the claim model and the deadline, and here comes the data. As you can see, most files, over 60%, are rejected, that is, sent back to the cloud within the first 1 hour after translators pick them. In fact, within the first 10 minutes. Now, when you ask, is that because something terrible happened? Well, no, unless you believe in Murphy's Law, saying that there's always something terrible happening just after you've picked up a file for translation. No. The answer is because they don't like it. They pick up the file, look at it, and say, we don't like that, so we push it back. And then, if they push it back, if they reject it, right after claim, that's fine. But if they reject it, then just before the deadline, that's not good. So we zoomed in on those translators who translate, and we checked who rejects a long time before the deadline. That's okay. And then on those who reject just before the deadline. That's not a good behavior, because it, of course, creates the risk that when the file is pushed back to the cloud, no one will pick it up, no one will manage to translate it within 30 minutes or 15 minutes, so those files will miss the deadline. So then we can zoom in on those individual translators because we know their names, or at least the names they give us, or at least we know their email address, and we can send them an email and modify that behavior to reduce the risk for missing deadlines. And the last story I want to tell you is the story of the almighty Pareto principle. You have probably heard about it under the name of the 20/80 rule. It basically says that for 80% of consequences, 80% of consequences are caused by 20% of the causes. So just to give you a few examples, it's actually a ubiquitous rule. It's a regular power law distribution, but stats show that 80% of all crimes are committed by 20% of the criminals. And 80% of all income goes to 20% of the population. How unfair, right? And that 80% of the usage of English language employs only 20% of its words. And that 80% of all damage caused by thunderstorms is caused by 20% of the thunderstorms. So then I thought, what about the community? And believe it or not, but 80% of all the volume that is translated in the community is delivered by 20% of the translators in that community. And that, again, has big implications, because that means that if we find those 20%, which is easy, and we focus on those 80% of translators who deliver 80% of the total volume, and we help them boost their quality, their adherence to deadline, we are going to affect the overall quality of the deliveries. So when I looked at that, I thought, that's cool. Then I thought, is it really so cool because our community behaves just like, criminals and thunderstorms? So I'm not sure that's actually such a good data. But then I decided, in fact, it is good information for us, because this shows that there is some universal math law, power law distribution underlying natural processes and communities, and it just shows you how beautiful data is. And I hope that with this talk I've inspired you to look into your data, be it your street lamp or translations or whatever, and just find how many things you can learn from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Marina. Do we have any questions in the room? You said you have 3 children? Wow. Was that the most difficult project you had?
Nope.
No?
I wouldn't think so.
What was the most difficult project, or what was the biggest challenge you faced throughout your career?
I think that the biggest challenge was when I started my PhD, because that was really very difficult from everything I'd done in my life before. Plus, it was in theoretical linguistics, or more specifically nanosyntax. And that's something that I had no idea about. So when I started it, there were all those master students who were already 5 years ahead of me talking about things. I was just looking at them and saying, yeah. So I had to kind of catch up 5 years in one and proceed with my own research. So that was, many sleepless nights.
Okay. We have a question here from Michaela. She's asking, what is your opinion on machine translations? Do you think that it will replace human translations in the near future?
Depends in which domain, right? Machine translation gets better and better, and in some languages it works already quite well. The big languages, which have lots of translated volume that feeds into training the machines. So I actually do think, even though I'm in the localization business working with human translators, I do think that machine translation has a big future and is going to replace human translations in many domains. But there are going to remain domains where the human element cannot be eliminated. These are more creative translations, literature translations, most marketing translations, and so on. It's just that translators will have to change their profile a bit and start working on different types of content.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much for this energetic presentation. Thank you, Marina, everybody.